Okay, we're continuing with my book, The Holy Grail of Wisdom Quotes. We're going in alphabetical order. This is part 2 of Dostoevsky, Fyodor Dostoevsky, the great Russian novelist. He had become heavily in debt from gambling, and he was in trouble of losing the rights to all his previous publications. The publishing company said, give us all the rights to your earlier publications if you want any money from us, and they also commanded he write them one more book, and he had to do it within a 1-year deadline, or they were going to take all the rights to all his previous publications. And he had been working on another project and procrastinating, and he was at high risk to be sent to debtor's prison, and he'd already spent 10 years in the equivalent of prison for his problem with the Tsar. So he didn't want that. He was desperate, and he found from a friend that he could go to a stenography school, and he asked the head of the stenography school, who's the best stenographer? And he was introduced to this lady, and he hired her to help him write his book. He had only 1 month to write a novel. Had to be at least 175 pages. And the lady was a great stenographer, and they became friends, and he ended up marrying her. He finished the entire novel in 1 month. It's called The Gambler. And I actually haven't read that. I've read a bunch of his books and his essays and stuff, but I haven't read that one, and tons of his everything about his quotes. But I have a friend from Russia, and she tells me that The Gambler is his best book. He wrote that in 1 month with this stenographer. Stenography, a good stenographer can write shorthand as fast as somebody could type. So it's pretty extraordinary writing an entire novel in one book. The key thing about writing a book, and I've written about 22 books, the key thing about writing a book is you have to think it all out in your brain. And once you think it all out in your brain, do I have something to say? Is this worth putting into a book? What order should it go in? What's the reason it's worth saying? Okay, how's it going to end? What is the catchy thing about the beginning? And then you have to make a mind map. Then once you've made a mind map, then you start writing it. Then you start making an outline. And but the key thing is that you can see it from start to finish in your brain, because then you know what to do. And it's almost like taking dictation from your brain. That's what it takes to write a big book. Okay, so here's some quotes from Dostoevsky. The best way to keep a prisoner from escaping is to make sure he never knows that he's in prison, which is kind of like the American people. They don't realize the constraints put upon them, and that's why you got to know. Like Goethe said something very similar. The mystery of human existence is not just to stay alive, but to find something to live for. Nothing in the world is harder than speaking the truth. Nothing is easier than flattery. Yeah, if you lie and you BS and you promote stuff for rich people, they'll help you out. But if you tell the truth, people will be offended and they kind of hate you. But some people will value it, the people who want the truth. Everything passes, only the truth remains. Yeah, that's the only thing is all these bullshit artists on the internet, sellouts and scumbags, they're popular for the moment, but they'll go down in history as scumbags versus the people who tell the truth. They'll be around, at least for the people who want to know the truth. But the people who want to know the truth should make sure they teach others about it. Otherwise, it will disappear. Down the memory hole, 1984. Okay, Dostoevsky continues. These are just some quotes here. We're going to get into his books here in a little bit. Only the heart knows how to find what is precious. That sounds like The Little Prince. Okay, Exupéry. Okay, only one thing matters, one thing, to be able to dare. You got to have the guts to do stuff or nothing happens. That's why they say courage is the most valuable virtue, because without it, the other ones don't get used in public. Another thing Dostoevsky used to say, beauty can save the world. And sort of what he meant by is like beautiful art, beautiful good things. And there's some truth to that. In the Counter-Reformation of the Catholic Church, their art was so magnificent, it's basically a wonderful refutation of, the Protestantism and of other religions. I mean, any culture that can produce the most magnificent art, the most magnificent music, the most magnificent architecture, the most magnificent literature, the most magnificent music. The Protestants also produced a lot of great music, like Bach and the Lutherans and all that. But, that's basically something that generates the best that mankind can do. That's a good thing. Okay, Dostoevsky continues. A merchant sells his goods, an intellectual sells his ideas, an inventor invents products, a true philosopher invents ideas. And then the other one's a little bit biblical. A grain of wheat is just a grain of wheat, but if it's put into the ground, then many will grow from it. Sort of like a person who makes the effort to help and teach others, it's sort of like fertilizes things and more good comes out of it. Okay, that's a very sort of a take on the biblical quote on the Taris. Okay, In 1860, 10% of Americans were slaves, but in Russia, about 90% of the people in 1860 were slaves or serfs. Dostoevsky was not real high like an aristocrat, but he wasn't a serf either. His father was a well-to-do doctor. Both his parents died when he was a teenager. He had a pretty difficult life. I think his father was sort of upset about a few things and mistreated the serfs, and then one of the serfs bumped him off. Okay, Fyodor Dostoevsky himself died when he was 59. His book Brothers Karamazov, like I said, I think it's like one of the top 3 greatest novels of all time. Freud thought it was the best novel ever written, and it did have a very much of an Oedipal theme, that's for sure. Dostoevsky himself was a bit neurotic. He wrote with what you would call a loose running style, was sort of his signature sentence, which is almost like the brain in real time, a little bit like free association, the mind figuring things out as it goes along. That's called a loose running style, cumulative syntax. You can keep on adding additional modifiers that describe things in more detail and more detail and more detail, like as the person figures it out. The main drama in Dostoevsky books is, like Brothers Karamazov, is attempting to figure out the meaning of life and what one should do with their own life and understanding human behavior. Dostoevsky has all kinds of observations and things like he notices, like the average person, they're not allowed to get away with anything. But if somebody's a big rich person, they can break every rule in the book and they don't ever get in trouble. And there's other people who said things like that, like Balzac. He said, the little bugs are caught in the spider's web. The big bugs just fly right through it. Okay, let's see. Here's a good quote. Does faith come from miracles, or do miracles come from faith? And there's a lot of truth in that. Look at the building of the cathedrals. The cathedrals were built back in the Middle Ages, in the 1200s and 1300s and 1400s. They had hardly any technology, no electricity, and they built the greatest buildings ever made. There's actually a music video I'd like you to see. The song is called Oceans. I'll put a link to it. I'll even make an individual video to it just because I want people to see how beautiful it is. The song is called Oceans. I don't remember the singer. I'll figure it out in a little bit. But the cathedral, it's so magnificent. They're by far the best buildings ever built. And they came back in the 1200s. That's what Christianity could do. Take a bunch of illiterate people, and I'm sure some of the engineers knew how to read, and create the best buildings of all time. They can't equal them today. They don't got the faith to do it. Okay, let's see, what else? Oh, here's another example. This one came from a book. I was reading a book about how to write openings to books. And this is by a guy named Noel Lukeman. It's real good. It's called From the First 5 Pages. And he says, another effective use of comparison can be found in Dostoevsky's Notes from the Underground. Here he says, I'm suspicious and easily offended, like a dwarf or a hunchback. Anyone could say they are suspicious and easily offended, and the reader will grasp this intellectually. But adding like a dwarf or a hunchback makes the reader understand, not just intellectually, but emotionally. And yeah, that's a typical example of that cumulative syntax where he just adds another little modifier on there, a free modifier, and that makes the sentence come alive. I'm suspicious and easily offended, intellectual, descriptive, show, don't tell. And then like a dwarf or a hunchback, that's to show it. Okay, so that's good writing. And, I read Notes from the Underground, and it was sort of shocking in how vulgar and rude and obnoxious and offensive it was in an interesting way. After reading all the boring stuff you have to read something like that was pretty interesting. So I'll just read you the opening line of it to get a sense of the things Dostoevsky does that are different than other writers, and certainly especially different for his time. Notes from the Underground starts out, I'm a sick man, a mean man. There's nothing attractive about me. I think there's something wrong with my liver, but actually I don't understand a damn thing about my sickness. I'm not even sure what's ailing me. I'm not under treatment, and I never have been, although I do have respect for medicine and doctors. I'm morbidly suspicious. I'm enough at least to respect medicine. Superstitious. With my education, I shouldn't be superstitious, but I am just the same. Okay? I don't expect you to understand, but that's how it is. Okay? He goes on and on, he says, I know I'm harming myself, but so what? It's still out of spite that I refuse to ask a doctor for help. So what if my liver helps? Good, let it hurt more. It's kind of crazy, and it goes on like that. So it was a little bit interesting. But I didn't actually like that book that much. Even though it was fascinating, the beginning and the way he talks, it doesn't really leave me with any useful moral lessons. So I actually don't think it's that good of a book. Other than for prose style, it was interesting. Dostoevsky, solitude for the mind is as essential as food for the body. Yeah, to develop your brain, you need time alone to read and think. Okay, Dostoevsky. People with new ideas, people with the faintest capacity for saying something new, are extremely few in number, extraordinarily so, in fact. Most people have a good idea and they're scared to say it. If you want to be smart, you got to talk, you got to take chances and risks. Okay, we'll briefly talk about another one of his books called The Idiot. And the Idiot is really like a story about what would happen if Christ came back to earth. And basically, the character was Prince Leo Mishkin, and his name is a contradiction, an oxymoron, because, you know, Prince sounds like royalty, Leo like a lion. Mishkin, though, means mouse in Russian. So he was the lion mouse, which basically, he was also this idea of a holy fool, somebody who's really good but sort of naive and fragile and innocent and vulnerable. And he was a Christ-like character, and sadly, you know, what Dostoevsky was trying to say is what would happen if Christ came to Russia, came back in person. And basically, they treated him like a fool. They were cruel to him. They rejected him. And the woman who kind of loved him still rejected him as a nice guy, loser, beta male. And she went out with this other guy who was like a devil, and he K-I-L-L-E-D'd her, okay? It's kind of brutal. A lot of Dostoevsky's novels, they don't back off. They're pretty brutal. You know, his name means horn, like the horns of the D, you know, whatever, you know, the book was kind of sad because you sit there and you're like cheering for Prince Leo Mishkin. You want things to work. He's trying to save a lady, but she rejects him and goes with an evil man who bumps her off, okay? So a lot of sad things happen in that book. But at the same time, you could exactly see how the people would behave that way, and that's what's kind of scary about the book. When he makes an argument, he makes the argument so strong that people give too much validity to evil people. So I liked the book, but man, it made me sad. So I was glad I read it, but it made me sad. That's kind of what it comes down to. And here's a quote by Michael Sugrue, the greatest philosophy teacher. I previously given lectures about Michael Sugrue. He said, all of Dostoevsky's novels are meditations on Christianity. And that is true. Christianity basically was concerned about the increasing secularization of Russian society, how it was becoming westernized in a bad way, secularized. And he was trying to figure out what he could do to help increase the affection of the Russian people for Christ, because he felt that was the only thing that could save him. And actually, he was completely right. Secularization led to the events of 1917, 1918 in Russia and the destruction of the country and turning the whole place into a crap hole. He knew that secularization was bad for the Russian people. So, in a sense, just like Nietzsche had predicted, you know, he said, we have killed God and there's nothing left to replace him, and the world is growing colder, and it's only going to get worse. And then Dostoevsky was saying the same thing in a different way. The only thing is Nietzsche was anti-Christian, but he really had nothing to replace him except with this idea of the Uberman, the Ubermensch, by which he meant himself. Okay? And with heroes like Napoleon. So Nietzsche didn't really have much to offer, anything that could replace Christianity. And Dostoevsky said, no, go back to Christianity. And his hero character, my favorite character from all his books, is Alyosha and Brothers Karamazov. We'll talk about Brothers Karamazov in part 3. That'll probably be the last of the parts on Dostoevsky. But it's a remarkable book. And all these books were sort of leading up to writing Brothers Karamazov. A couple more quotes from Dostoevsky. From 1,000 rabbits you cannot make a horse. Inventors and men of genius have almost always been regarded as fools at the beginning of their careers and often all the way to the end of their careers. Now here's a quote I like. The man who is happy is he who is fulfilling his purpose. And that's very much like Watson's quote. An animal's happy when it does what it's meant to do. And other people have said that too. Thomas Shaw's meaning is what brings happiness and helps a person get over their social problems. Okay, Dostoevsky. Men reject their prophets and they slay them. But they love their martyrs and they honor those whom they have slain. Yeah, sadly that's reality too. So anyways, that's part 2 of Dostoevsky. Hope that was helpful.